Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Charles Roseman. He's an associate professor of evolution, ecology, and behavior at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He studies the evolution of complex traits, and today we're going to talk about complex traits, how they evolve, hominin evolution, particularly focusing on Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, hereditarianism, differences between human populations, and sex. So, Dr. Roseman, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
So, let's start then with complex traits. So, first of all, what is a complex trait from an evolutionary perspective? I mean, what it makes the difference between a complex trait and, I guess we could say, a simple trait?
So the funny thing is that the complex traits are often simpler than the simple traits, in that complex traits are usually the ones where there are many different genetic and environmental influences that come together either in combination or in interaction to produce variation in a trait. And in humans, the canonical complex trait is height, stature. So how tall you are.
Yeah.
And this contrasts from what we think of as simple Mendelian traits. So the various things that Mendel was looking at in his pea plants and that sort of thing. It turns out that there are not that many of those simple traits, those Mendelian traits. Most of the traits that we deal with when we're dealing with organisms in just about any context are complex in that they have lots and lots of different influences. Now, complex isn't necessarily a very good word. Complexity is a bit of a trap because everybody thinks they know what it is, and I haven't heard a satisfactory definition for it in general. So one of the nice things about complex traits like stature, that is height, and any of the morphological characteristics that I tend to study is that they're amenable to kind of a statistical summary approach. We don't need to know the identity of every single gene or environmental influence to make statements about how relatives are going to resemble one another and to predict how they're going to evolve.
But I mean, how do you approach the study of complex traits? Because I know that particularly for evolutionarily minded researchers, many times the way they go about things is that they start from an adaptationist perspective. But of course, there are other mechanisms through which traits evolve or come about. Like, for example, sometimes they are byproducts or how some people call them spandrels. Other times they come about through genetic drift. So how do you approach their study exactly?
Okay, so you brought up the adaptationist approach, and
Yes.
while I think that natural selectionism is quite important, and don't get me wrong on that, I get a little worried about the adaptationist approach.
Yeah.
So, and the reason for that is that if you are looking at an organism and you see it doing something that strikes you as interesting, and then you say, then it must have evolved to do that.
Yeah.
Well, what are you doing? Well, this is very similar to the natural theological argument that, say, William Paley came up with quite a long time ago. He was an influence on Darwin.
Yeah.
And the idea is that in his thought experiment, Paley is walking through a heath and a meadow or something like that and finds a watch. And the watch is complex and it seems to track time and all those sorts of things. And he said that, well, this is well designed and that means there must have been a designer. And if you take natural selection as the designer and put it into that argument, you have only solved a part of the problem. You've solved the deity problem, the designer problem, the conscious designer problem, but you haven't solved the evolutionary problem. And the evolutionary problem is the one where we would like to know something about the what did the organism start as when we are interested in the evolution of a trait. So we want to know the ancestral state. And then we want to know the processes, the dynamics that led up to the characteristic that we're looking at today, or the difference between the organism we're looking at and the rest of the living world. So that's the evolution part. And as you said, that involves a number of things. Recombination, it involves genetic drift. There might have been gene flow and hybridization. Mutation, of course, is very important for keeping variation around in the first place, all that type of thing. So if we want to do that, having a dynamical approach is what I would say. I'd say evolutionary approach, but that seems to dismiss adaptationists as not being evolutionary, and that's not really my meaning. And the study of complex traits gives that to you. It gives you a way to formalize the study of the evolution of complex traits so that you can build models and test hypotheses about how things changed when they did change.
But so just for the audience to get a more clear picture of what we're talking about here, let's say that you get across a complex trait in any kind of species out there. It might be a behavioral trait, a psychological trait, a morphological trait. How do you first approach its study theoretically, methodologically, to really then understand and know whether it was the result of natural selection or sometimes specifically sexual selection? Or if it was the result of something like genetic drift, or if it's a byproduct of certain specific adaptations?
Okay, well, the first thing you need to do is have a good sense of the organism. You need to know what you're measuring, and you need to have a sense of how the organism is put together. That includes how it develops, so on and so forth. Let's leave that aside for the moment. Let's assume that we have that and just deal with the evolutionary issues. Well, one of the great tools of evolutionary biology is the neutral theory. And so this is the idea that evolution might take place only by random genetic drift and the neutral theory of evolution supposes that a circumstance under which evolution is taking place only because of a random genetic drift and neutral mutations being put into the population. So these are mutations that don't affect the survivorship and reproduction of the organisms. So it's they're neutral with respect to fitness, so no natural selection arises as a result. So what's nice about that is that it gives us some clear connections between what molecular variation ought to look like and what phenotypic variation ought to look like. So rather than coming up with a infinitely large series of hypotheses and models and explanations that feature natural selection, which can operate in all kinds of different ways, this allows us to write out some very simple expectations under that are restricted in number. So the possibility space is really small. And what this lets us know is that if we reject the neutral hypothesis, or if another model fits better than the neutral model, then we have a warrant to go and look deeper, try to find out if natural selection might have been operating on something, or if there's phenotypic plasticity that's involved in the variation in a characteristic.
But in your mind, because we've mentioned here the adaptationist approach, what would you say are perhaps some of the issues with approaching the study of traits, complex traits, or even simple traits, with an adaptationist approach in mind? That is, assuming that they must have been the result of natural selection, sexual selection, that is, that they are adaptations, starting with that assumption. What do you think are the issues or might be the issues with that?
Well, so one of the issues is that there are very, very many ways in which you can produce exactly the same thing using natural selection. You can know a lot about the natural history. You can tell that, if, say, you reject a neutral hypothesis of the evolution of a characteristic, you can still then have very, very many hypotheses about what natural selection might have done to adapt an organism. And this is one of the wonderful things about Darwin's insights, and a few other people as well, is that it can explain a lot. That's also its shortcoming. If natural selection explains everything, it doesn't really explain much of anything. It doesn't allow us to make the kinds of distinctions that allow us to, talk about the dynamics, or come up with plausible alternatives. And it's also an empirical issue. This is where there's a difference between the study of humans, what makes humans unique, which is one instance,
Yes.
and the study of, say, how body size and brain size evolve together. That involves a comparative study of lots and lots of organisms, as opposed to just looking at one organism. And the general trends that you might see across vertebrates, across mammals, across whatever, may give you a sense of what tends to drive the evolution of any one of these features, but it doesn't necessarily give you an indicator of what drove any one transition. So, we could have a very, very clear picture from comparative studies about what's going on with the evolutions of brains or bodies or whatever, and still not have much of an idea for what is going on with humans. We have conspicuously large brains that evolved over, let's say the last 2 million years or so. That's the important bit. And I don't think that there are very many satisfactory adaptationist explanations, even though we're really pretty sure from a number of angles that natural selection was probably involved. It's just that, and everybody's coming up with these accounts that propose functions that might relate to fitness, but we don't really have a good reason to believe many of the stories over a lot of the other stories. So the dynamical account is quite good in that you can understand the evolution of something without necessarily understanding the function. And that's important because there have been very, very few studies that actually relate what a morphological characteristic does in the functional biology of an organism to the fitness of the organism, and then put that in the context of genetic variation in all of those parts to describe how it might change. So, and that is I'm not saying we should expect that of every study. That's the ideal study. That would be absolutely wonderful to have, but it's certainly beyond the reach. But it's worth knowing that that there are serious limitations that come from the perspective where you see something, it seems to do something really well, and it must have evolved for that function. That doesn't get you as close to a satisfactory answer as you might think.
Do you think that perhaps one of the specific risks here is that if people start from an adaptationist perspective, that they are more prone to developing what some people call just so stories about the evolution and the origins and the development of any specific trait, because I would imagine that trying to assume that because a particular trait is there, then it's because it probably increased fitness for the organism or the whatever kind of species we're talking about, perhaps makes people more prone to trying to come up with stories for why that link is supposedly there or not.
Yeah, so I think that is true. If you don't take the dynamic of evolution, if you don't take the evolutionary history into account, then you are prone to just telling a just so story. I don't think that's nearly as common as a lot of people would have us believe. Certainly not in evolutionary biology, maybe in some other corners of the world. But the dynamic approach, the sort of the evolutionary genetic approach, the complex trait approach allows you to do a number of other things. So one of the things that if we talk about brain size, it becomes conspicuously large in humans over the last 2 million years. It was probably natural selection driving it, along with a few other things. And most of the models don't believe it was brain size itself. So, it's the capacities for certain kinds of behavior, certain kinds of cognitive abilities, and so on and so forth that are supposedly drove it. So what we're looking at is a correlated response, or under this model, it would be a correlated response to natural selection on something else. Now that happens when you have a genetic correlation between characteristics. Natural selection works on one, it changes the frequencies of the alleles that are involved in that one trait, but those loci, where those genetic variants, I should say, are those loci, those places in the genome, also affect the other trait. And so the other trait gets dragged along with it.
Yeah.
So you can have strong natural selection on something else, and it can also cause a change in whatever you happen to be looking at. Now, this raises a problem because there are many, many ways in which to measure an organism. And natural selection can behave in all kinds of very strange ways. So you very, very infrequently think that, or are justified in thinking that you're actually measuring the thing that is important for driving the fitness differences that make natural selection. Okay, so that's one thing. We could talk about correlated responses. There's always the problem, not a problem, there's always the possibility that you're looking at phenotypic plasticity. So the same genotype, if you raise an organism with the same genotype under different circumstances, you may end up with a rather different phenotype depending on the environmental conditions. That happens quite a bit. And then there is also the feature of organisms, well, if you look at complex multicellular organisms like us, and you look at our genomes, eukaryotic genomes, they're very messy places. The genome is uniquely inappropriately named for eukaryotes because almost nothing in it is a gene. It's a very, very small percentage is actually a gene. And there are all these repeated elements and transposable elements and retroviral inserts and any number of other things that go on. And and this is the grounds for a lot of natural selection at a different level that we don't necessarily appreciate when we're looking at full organisms. But also, what's interesting about it is that, why is there all that slop in the genome? It takes forever for us to replicate cells. It's just incredibly energetically expensive. Bacteria are just the epitome of efficiency by comparison. So how does that work out? Shouldn't natural selection be getting rid of all of this, the slop in the system, all this waste of energy? And if you think about bacteria versus humans, one notable thing about bacteria is that there are a lot more bacteria than there are humans. A lot more bacteria than there are humans on you right now or on me right now. And what this means is that the effect of random genetic drift, just those random changes because of sampling in populations, are practically negligible in bacteria, but profound in organisms like us or mice or mushrooms or whatever. And what this means is that natural selection is only so efficient. It's only so good up to a point. And we have to leave room for that in the model because genetic drift is ubiquitous. And there are lots and lots of things out there that seem quite mysterious until you think natural selection just isn't that powerful.
So to try to illustrate all of this with an example, you've already mentioned a couple of times there the evolution of the cranium in hominins. Tell us a little bit more about that. And I know that you've done work, for example, on the evolutionary path to the genus Homo, that is the transition from Australopithecus to Homo. And you've done work specifically on the evolution of the cranium. So could you tell us about that? What did you find? And in terms of these different mechanisms that make for a trait to evolve or to develop, how do they apply here? I mean, the evolution of the cranium, as far as we know, has been mostly the result of natural selection or any other mechanism that we talked about here.
Yeah, so the early part of the human evolution, the work that I did on that, the Australopithecus leading up to Homo, and then later on in the Pleistocene, most of that work was done by Lauren Schroeder and Becky Ackerman, and I was helping out with some of that. But later on, when we're talking about human variation today, that's where my expertise is, and that's where I've been focused. Now, I talked about brain size getting bigger, and I talked about how natural selection was probably involved, and I mean probably in the scientific sense, in which I'd be very, very, very surprised if it wasn't. But the rest of it, the morphology of your face, the morphology of parts of your cranial base, the part of your skull that rests on top of your spine, a lot of that looks to be quite neutral. That is, it doesn't seem to affect fitness or hadn't affected fitness. And we know this for a couple of reasons. I mentioned earlier that there is a nice relationship between genomic variation and phenotypic variation if nothing interesting is happening. So if it's only random genetic drift, then we expect a certain kind of relationship between the phenotypic variation and the molecular variation, genomic variation. And we see that in human populations today, with some exceptions here and there. You know, there's natural selection is apparent in some places. What drove that natural selection is a total mystery. Now, what's interesting about this is that human cranial form outside brain size has evolved very, very quickly. It's very high evolutionary rates over longish spans of time. And this is in comparison to other mammals. And the rates themselves look quite neutral. So, it's just awfully corny, but I like to say if we're made in the image of God, then God played dice, because most of our visage is sort of cobbled together randomly. And this is not to say that, when I was first proposing this, I was not the first to propose this, but I was one of the first to link it up with the genomic variation to bring it along. There was a lot of pushback because a lot of people had their adaptationist stories or their stories about plasticity that they quite liked. And they didn't really care for the idea that it was just lots and lots of random changes. So that's, I guess, an example getting back to the hazards of adaptation is that if you have tons and tons and tons of anthropologists looking at very, very few fossils, everybody's going to want to find something. And it's sort of the worst degrees of freedom problem you could possibly imagine. More researchers than there are objects of study. And that can lead you astray in fundamental ways. And I think that was an example of it.
So at least at this point, according to the best evidence we have and the way you read it, you would say that most of the morphology of our cranium was the result of random processes and not something like adaptation or phenotypic plasticity. Is that it?
Yeah. There are secondary effects of both adaptation and phenotypic plasticity. I'd say that we can say that natural selection happened. I don't know how
Yeah.
adaptive it was. That's a
Okay.
distinction that we have to bear in mind. David Cates and Noreen von Kramenn-Taubadel and a few other people have done these quite interesting studies where they take a comparative approach and they're able to test hypotheses about what happens when you do, say, a transition from hunting and gathering to farming. What happens to the skeleton in that kind of a context? And they're able to do it, controlling for the evolutionary history behind it. And you could discover they found the effects of plasticity kind of small in comparison to the old arguments, but they're pretty robust findings because they're done in this process-informed comparative framework.
And so, could you tell us about the differences at the level of the cranium between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens? What are the main differences we find there? And what kinds of information can we get from that? Can we get, for example, any possible information about differences in terms of their brains, for example, or not really?
Well, I don't know a whole lot about how to recover information about brain structure from from fossils, and there are certainly people out there who do it, and I can't really comment on it at a professional level. What I can say is that the differences between humans today and Neanderthals are largely neutral, quite strikingly so. And the rate of evolution between Neanderthals and humans today is the same, or give or take a little tiny bit, as the very quick evolution among different groups of humans today. So we're just looking at an extension of the same dynamic going back in time. And it seems to scale linearly with time. Or properly scaled, it scales linearly with time. It's really quite fascinating and unusual. So there were lots and lots and lots of adaptive explanations for differences between Neanderthals and humans that had to do with adaptation to one thing or another, or plasticity, because Neanderthals have characteristic tooth wear that indicates that they chewed on things, maybe hides, while they were processing them or something like that. And and that made a plastic response to their behaviors. I think that a lot of these stories are, it's not to say that they aren't true. Some of them might be. It's just the evidence for them is weakened by quite a bit. So a lot of it looks quite random. And I should say that is unusual for mammals. Mammals typically don't have that very rapid evolutionary rates that look like random genetic drift over very long periods of time.
And do we have any idea why that's the case? What would have been the forces or factors playing a role there? Do we know anything about that?
Yeah, well, that's a it's a very, very difficult question. And in 20 years of thinking about it, I don't think that I've come up with a satisfactory answer for it. Typically, if I were to reach back into the literature, it might be that there's something about humans using technology, tradition, culture, whatever, to modify our environments such that we don't end up with natural selection affecting the bodily form nearly as much as you might expect in other organisms. But I'd file that under speculation. It's a little difficult. It's hard to tell what natural selection is doing when it's doing it. It's harder still to say why natural selection isn't doing something. So that's occasionally we have to be content with ignorance and wait for more findings. And I'd say that's where this is.
And another thing we haven't talked about yet here has to do with gene exchange between species. Has something like hybridization occurred a lot during human evolution? And if so, what do we know about it and its potential effects?
Yeah, so this is something that Becky Ackerman at the University of Cape Town has done quite a bit of work on, and the extent to which I've done work on it has been connected with her work. And of course, this is something that is very popular among the paleogenomics people, and they can address those topics much better than I can. It's clear that, say, different differentiated groups of humans have hybridized. It doesn't appear to be, say, gene flow that's sort of constantly going back and forth between regions at a very low level through time. It seems like there are episodic sort of events in which hybridization might take place. Now, that's interesting because many people living today carry with them a Neanderthal component or a Denisovan component of their genomes that might, in some cases, have something to do with how they've been able to adapt to certain environments. Might have something to do with your immune function. That sort of thing is very much in its infancy, or figuring out exactly what that does. And one of the reasons why that's a difficult problem to deal with is that when you deal with organisms that have evolved separately for a while and then come back together, you end up with something called heterosis, where the expectation for the hybrid offspring is not sort of an average of the parents or anything like that. It's somewhere else. And that is very, very difficult to get a handle on because it involves interactions. It involves dominance and recessive effects at various loci in the genome, and then what are called epistatic effects, the interactions among different parts of the genome. So if you shuffle up two genomes and throw them together, you can end up with things changing their functions in really radical and unpredictable ways. Now, this is interesting because you display a whole new way of generating variation, and that might be interesting for telling us about how human organisms in the past did respond to natural selection and how they might have adapted. But it's that's a very difficult problem.
So changing topics now, I know that you're very interested and you've written a lot about this, very interested in the debate between the so-called hereditarians and the anti-hereditarians. So, just to first frame the debate, could you tell us what the debate is really about and what are the main points of contention here when it comes to understanding differences between human populations or differences between people that have different ancestries, let's say?
So starting with the hereditarian position, I'd say that the hereditarian position is that there are biological races of humans So race as we might experience it today is not necessarily a artifact of a social process. It reflects evolutionary processes over deep time, evolutionary time. So that's the first thing. And you can organize people into these races based on their characteristics and ancestry and so on and so forth. That's the first claim. So the second claim is that those groups differ. And the third claim is that those groups differ in ways that are not just environmental. There's also a evolved genetic component to it. And so the response to that is pretty highly varied across academia, and that there are certainly social scientists who don't want anything to do with genetics. They immediately think it's eugenics, and they leave the conversation right away. I don't. They tend not to like me as much as they, dislike the hereditarians. So, we're in the same boat together in that, in a lot of ways. The main things boil down to are races biological categories, that is, evolved categories that we can attribute to processes acting over deep time, or are they social constructions in the product of social dynamics? And what do differences mean, and what does it mean to be a genetic difference or an evolved difference between the two? And so this, now I study genetic differences between groups of humans. So am I hereditarian? No. The reasons I'm not a hereditarian would be that I don't think that race is a deep evolved biological feature of humankind. And I also think that the hereditarian perspective on genetics relies on a set of popular misconceptions about what genetics is. So, and this relates to genetic determinism in one way or another, a very specific flavor of it, where if you see a genetic difference in one context, that must necessarily mean that it will manifest itself in all other contexts. So what this means is that, I might say that, okay, well, there's a difference here. Let's say it's something we care about. Let's say that we change the circumstances, we might end up with a situation in which the differences are flip-flop. We might end up in a situation where they are completely ameliorated. We don't know. Right. Whereas a hereditarian would say that these differences are driving the social outcome differences that we see in society today. And, so I guess that when it comes to the question about biological race and whether race is a social construction or not, I think that you might have something to ask about that a little later. So let's you just go ahead from there.
Yeah, let me just clarify one point there. When you mentioned genetic determinism, what that means exactly is that whenever people endorse a view that goes along or that falls under the umbrella, let's say, of genetic determinism, they are making a claim that a particular trait is the result of whatever set of genes, and it is mostly or completely impermeable to environmental influences. Is that it?
Yeah, insensitivity to changes in environmental context. So, and then as a set of, it's a very diffuse type of thing, the lack of clarity leaves a lot of room for mischief, but that's the core of it.
So also perhaps to illustrate this, of course, there are many traits out there that people make claims about traits where I mean, some of them are clear differences that we find between people of different ancestries. Others are disputed. And of course, one of the most disputed ones has to do with intelligence and IQ. So there are people that argue very strongly for IQ being mostly genetically determined and for clear differences in IQ between different races. For example, between whites and blacks in America, between Jews and Europeans, between Jews and East Asians, etc., etc. So what do you make of that? I mean, because there are several different aspects to this argument that we can tackle it, but generally speaking, what do you make of the arguments put forth by people who argue that, first of all, IQ is mostly genetically based, and second, that differences in IQ between human groups or population are mostly explained by genetic differences?
Yeah, so the first thing that I'd say is that they're really not doing any research into that front. They come at you with tables of numbers, and they're relying on I shouldn't say they're relying on the arguments get shaped by people's impressions of what's being delivered to them. And for instance, there's lots of arguments about heritability, which is the proportion of variation in a population with respect to a trait that is attributable to genetic effects as opposed to environmental effects. And heritability just doesn't tell you anything in and of itself about how malleable or plastic a trait might be. Okay, so it just we could write the math out, and there's just absolutely nothing there. The within group heritability doesn't tell you anything about the between group heritability unless you add in some actual evolutionary theory that tells you how you got the differences between the groups in the first place. Now, hereditarians don't do that. They they don't have the evolutionary component to that argument. So they can't tell me how strong natural selection was when. They can't tell me any of these types of things. They're not proposing any evolutionary argument. They're just saying these numbers are different. Now, and that's true. The number 100 is different from the number 85, but that's not terribly interesting. So towards the beginning of our discussion, I talked about how you really need to know the organism.
Yes.
And educational attainment and cognitive ability, IQ, whatever you want to talk about it, behaves very strangely as a complex trait now that we've had genome-wide association studies coming in. It's the difference between the estimates of the effective genetics from the genome-wide association studies, where you just go through and count up everything that looks like it has an effect on the trait, compile them, and you come up with a summary statistic of how much variation you can account for. That tends to be very small, especially when you get rid, statistically control for a lot of the tendency for different things to be inherited together in humans that aren't, strictly speaking, heritable. So your economic situation, your what area you happen to live in, what your family is like, and so on and so forth. It's very, very attenuated. And it's rather different than looking at something like height or something like even body mass or something like that. There's something very different going on. And the hereditarians seem to be wedded to their old twin estimates, which, people in evolutionary biology don't take very seriously. And we tend not to use, mostly because a lot of organisms don't display twins. But even in cattle where you do have regular twinning, people don't go out of their way to find the twins because they know that the estimates tend to be bad. That is, the estimates of the effects of genes on variation that you get from comparing twins are are just upwardly biased in a big way. Okay, um, so what I'd say is that the hereditarians claim that they're arguing for, or they're making an evolutionary argument for differences among groups, but there's no evolution there. The genetics are pointed in the wrong direction. They're not looking at the right issues. It really is just a collection of summary statistics of dubious quality that get thrown out there. And, the between group heritability versus within group heritability discussion is a prime example of that. Yeah. There's no relationship between those two quantities unless you add in some evolutionary theory, which the hereditarians refuse to do. And the hereditarians like to use between group heritability and within group heritability to figure out how plausible a difference between groups might be if it were entirely environmental. And there's some pretty basic algebra errors in it. And it just keeps on going through the literature. So the main problem with hereditarianism is not that, there are other problems with it, but when we speak about it scientifically, is that it's just not there. They're not making the relevant arguments. They're not producing science that we would understand as being informed by modern evolutionary biology. Now, their motivations are their own. I don't read minds. I don't pretend to be able to peer into their souls or that sort of thing. I can say that they're not doing the science that they claim to be doing.
And I mean, if you will allow me, and please comment on what I'm about to say. I mean, even when it comes to just the science, because of course, let's try to leave motivations and politics aside here, just focusing on the science. Even when it comes to trying to, I mean, extrapolate from within group heritability to between group heritability, even if someone takes very seriously, for example, the work done in behavioral genetics when it comes to studying twins, adopted kids, adopted people, etc. I mean, even the behavioral geneticists themselves say, and I know this because I've talked with people like Robert Plomin for the show and others, they say that their methodologies, the work they do, does not allow for someone to do that kind of extrapolation. I mean, they're studying within group heritability, within group differences between people that are part of the group they're studying in a particular environment. They, for example, Robert Plomin told me that, for example, it doesn't allow for us to really study very well differences between men and women, between different groups of people, between different races, if you want. And also when it comes to the databases, many times hereditarians point to when talking about or making claims about differences in IQ between people from Africa and people from Europe, just to give an example. Those databases are extremely poor, and they are based on an extremely small sample, and I would add convenient sample, convenient for the narrative that they are putting forth, particularly when it comes to the samples from Africa. I mean, they are extremely limited, an extremely small number of people, and we can't really tell anything from those data scientifically, right?
Yeah, and the point about the behavioral genetics is important in that there's really nothing evolutionary about behavioral genetics as it's practiced. This may sound a little strange, but you need the extra theoretical evolutionary component to relate within group heritability to between group heritability. And that's simply not appearing either in behavioral genetics, because it's not really the point of the field. It's not appearing in the hereditarian literature because they don't appear to be all that interested in evolution. So.
Mhm. And then another thing that I read about in your work, and now focusing more on the anti-hereditarians, you say in one of your papers that they bring to the table arguments based on complexity and a demand for mechanistic as opposed to variational explanations. Could you explain the argument you're making there and why that might be an issue that they're using those kinds of arguments?
Yes. So anti-hereditarians are against hereditarianism. That's about all that unifies anti-hereditarians. There are lots and lots and lots of different flavors. So
Yeah.
there and the paper is not about sort of groups of anti-hereditarians. It's more about different flavors of argument that I find objectionable.
Right.
And in terms of the wanting a causal mechanistic explanation of what's going on, they usually mean they want to know what genes are involved, and they want to know what the protein products of those genes are doing and what the metabolism is doing, and so on and so forth. And that's sort of besides the point, because we just as a matter of fact, we can do quite a bit of evolution without knowing or we can do a lot of evolutionary biology without knowing the mechanistic basics. We can use quantitative genetics. We can use those elegant simplicities that come out of the bewildering complexity of the genotype-phenotype map. This is where a lot of statistics come from in the first place. You have to do it very, very carefully. That's true. Now, what's interesting about this is that demand for mechanism, that demand for this very highly reduced account of what is going on, is kind of a expression of the bad habit that they attribute to hereditarians. They call them reductionists, they call them determinists. And what they're doing is they're saying, yes, we agree with you that genetics is deterministic and reductionistic. We agree with hereditarians on that. And we want more of it. We just don't have enough of it. And so, the correct answer for when somebody says some characteristic is X heritable, and I'm going to talk about the social and political ramifications of that, is to say, you're dealing with the wrong statistic. That's not going to tell you anything. It's not to say I want to see the genes, because that is a validation of the same kind of determinism and reductionism that anti-hereditarians complain about in hereditarians. Complexity is another thing. I think I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion that complexity is awfully convenient rhetorical trick to hide behind, in that you can say just about anything is bafflingly complex, and people seem to like to hear that. That plays well with a certain kind of audience. It really explains nothing. And if it's complex is the answer, what's the question? And at a practical level, to tell that something is complex takes quite a lot of data sometimes. And those are data that we just don't have in a lot of contexts. You need to be able to find some signal in a system that looks very noisy. And this is one of the problems, is that if you don't have that variational sense going in, you don't have that statistical sense, you can take any random set of data and concoct a very, very convincing story about it. And lots and lots of stories about how people get sucked into gambling addictions and so on and so forth, because they're absolutely convinced that they have a system, they see through the complexity, they can apprehend it, and they can manipulate it, and they are absolutely wrong. So it's a kind of a dangerous rhetorical device, because on one hand, it it you're saying somehow, well, we can't really know what's going on, but I can see something that somebody else can't. It turns you into an oracle, and
Mhm.
people tend to be attracted to that when they're charismatic enough, and so on and so forth. But it really doesn't explain a whole lot, and it comes with the danger of telling stories about noise. So those would be my complaints. And I think that one of the problems with anti-hereditarianism is both a tendency to say everything's complex to the point where uh, you can't have a theory about anything. Because
Mhm.
theories involve simplifications, theories involve abstractions, they involve generalizations. And if everything is so complex that you can't have any of those, you have no theory. You don't have the possibility of science. And it just seems to be uh, it it's a non-answer to a non-question. It's just a it's just a statement for statement's sake, a rhetorical trick.
Mhm. So, just to ask you about this point directly, how do you think we should think about the role of genes and their potential causal power when it comes to understanding differences between human populations?
So, in terms of their causal power, well, so the first thing to remember is that genes are parts of organisms.
Mhm.
And we want to get to know the organism as biologists, as anthropologists, as social scientists, or humanists in general. And we need to have some sense about what the context in which those genes are operating is like. Um, and what we can say is that in carefully controlled settings, where we have the right study design, they're usually epidemiological rather than experimental. And if they're experimental in humans, you probably shouldn't be doing them. Um, you have you can come up to the conclusion that substituting this variant of the gene for another in this context will cause this change. All right. So, and this
Mhm.
goes back to R.A. Fisher's idea of causation. What happens if not? What happens under a counterfactual
Mhm.
situation? Now, the problem is that we don't know what the organism is like across the all sorts of the of possible environments in which you could find yourself. And a really good example of this is the use of genomics for medical purposes. The whole point of that is to basically, people look for drug targets. They're looking for things that they can add a chemical to you and they will fix you, and then probably make a whole bunch of side effects that they can make drugs to then treat. It's a great business model. Um, but uh, the whole point behind genomics, pharmacogenomics, medical genomics, is to use properties of the organisms to find environments, that is, a new chemical that you ingest, to change a life outcome.
Mhm.
So it's a search for environmental possibility. It's not a statement about genetic determination. And the way that I take that is that if we're interested in other characteristics that behavioral characteristics or morphological characteristics, um, we really need to have a sense of what the organism might do in other circumstances. And humans have a bad track record of conforming to our expectations. So I would say that it's very, very difficult beyond certain well-known systems to say what will happen. If you completely lack the ability to digest something past a certain age, the lactose malabsorption into adulthood, or the lactase persistence into adulthood, then you have a pretty good idea of what environments in which you might face problems if you don't produce lactase as an adult. That is the enzyme that breaks down lactose. And you also know what to do about it with cultural innovations like a pill with a bunch of enzymes in it. So it's very, very difficult to go from a very general property of an organism to a statement about what they're going to do in general. Now, this is not to say, that there are going to be very, very general things that you need to be aware of. We need water, we need proper shelter, can't be too hot, can't be too cold, so on and so forth. But those are very generic properties of organisms that are tailored a little bit to humans, but not so much. So it's extremely difficult to say that that there are genetic differences in the first place. Then it's very difficult to find the causal mechanisms. It's very difficult to predict what they're going to do across contexts. So at that point, you can have an evolved difference between two groups, and you can change the environment, and then that might completely reorder or entirely disappear. So that is something that that is a profound challenge for all of biology and anthropology. And it's not something that you get at with heritability estimates or even GWAS. It's quite a bit more going on.
Mhm.
Sorry for the vague answer. That was
no worries at all. I was just going to say, and I guess that probably this point would also apply to the medical field. Isn't it also, I mean, a little bit limiting and perhaps in a sense worrying that many times we are making some inferences when it comes to, for example, thinking about races just on the basis of skin color. I mean, because, for example, in the medical field, I know that there are populations in Africa where people are more susceptible to developing falciform anemia. But I mean, if you're assuming, for example, in the medical field, that just because someone has a darker skin color, that they have some African ancestry, that they would be potentially more susceptible to that kind of disease. I mean, you might miss a lot in terms of diagnosis because the skin color itself just by itself doesn't tell you much about even the subpopulation in Africa where the ancestry of that person might have come from, right? I mean, does this make sense or?
Yes, yeah. So this using race as a diagnostic category in medicine has a long and not terribly useful history. It's oftentimes quite shocking what happens, and the point there that you're making is that the correlations between different characteristics at different levels may be different. So at the worldwide level, it may be quite different than it is at the local level, Simpson's paradox, that sort of thing. And they're very seldom good enough to have a very strong indicator of what, based on one property of an individual, what else they might be likely to present as a symptom or as a susceptibility or something along those lines. So yeah, that is it's a persistent worry. And this is kind of where the difficulty with talking about either race as an evolved category or race as a social construct comes into things. Because race is a social construction, that's not a very informative thing. It's kind of like saying adaptation comes from natural selection. It's such a broad explanatory tool that you really need to refine it. So the question I like to approach is, I like to say that, well, race as we understand it isn't it isn't a deep evolutionary phenomenon. We know that because race models don't predict human variation at all well. So a lot of the principal components analysis plots that you see floating around on the internet, where you've got brightly colored patches of peoples, the problem with principal components analysis is that it's not an analysis, it's a depiction, and people are just sort of painting race onto it as they see fit. And you'll see clustering algorithms going around. Well, it turns out that they miss so much of the variation, even between groups, that you need much better models that don't include race, that include much more complex structures. And I could say complex legitimately because we have the data and to test with the complexity, and we can see that. So race doesn't explain the evolution of humans. We cannot say that humans come in these deep evolved races. Talk about today, well, race is a very real part of our everyday experiences in the United States, certainly in Portugal, and your experience in Portugal and my experience in the United States are going to be rather different. There are going to be some commonalities, that's for certain, but who gets counted as what and how the dynamic works out can be very different. Right. Now, the question then becomes, if races are social constructions and they're driven by these political processes, if racism is what's sort of shaping and reinforcing them, why do you see genetic differences between groups? So I like to ask this very simple answer, or very, very simple question, I should say. Where did you get your genes?
Where did I get my gene? I
Yes.
guess that from my parents, right?
Great. Okay. Yeah, perfect. Where did you get your parents?
From my grandparents.
Well, not really. They kind of had to go through a social milieu to end up meeting and then producing you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
And, there are lots of social factors that go into that. So, and that is one of the things that, one of the ways in which you do get obvious genetic differences between groups of humans that we call races that are social constructions. So the way I like to put it is that, the genome, a collection of genes that typifies any organism, that's not a social construction.
Yeah.
But my genome and your genome are quite literally social constructions because of the ways in which parents meet to reproduce.
Yeah.
So if what this does is this way of thinking about things, and this is not original to me. Ashley Montague, who's an anthropologist, talked about this. A whole bunch of people a long time ago whose work has been forgotten about talk about this. But the very act of reproduction in a society is heavily influenced by various social dynamics. Racism is one of them. Class is a big deal in terms of who gets to marry one another. So the very act of reproduction in humans is socially mediated in important ways by race and racism, by class and class snobbery and various things like that. So you end up with a situation where we have to think about the ways in which our histories as societies, not just our prehistories as human beings or as organisms, um, shape the variation that we see in societies. And that's a little bit unsettling for people in a lot of ways. But and I don't think that we really know how to talk about that very well. There are some social scientists who are starting to talk about it, and they'd be much better at it than I would. My ability to deal with some of the subtleties and nuances limited, and I'm certainly not a historian. So, but this is one of the problems with the humanities scientific divide.
Yes.
Where so much pushback against anything that mentions genetics in the humanities, and people in the sciences tend to look down on the humanities in ways that are, sort of mean and not at all productive. But that we want to understand it. That's what we have to understand.
So, I mean, just to close off this section on the topic of race, so would you say then that race, even though it is not a scientifically valid concept from the perspective of genetics, biology, and anthropology, if we're talking about humans, of course, it is something that we can talk about scientifically, I guess, from the perspective of sociology, cultural anthropology, and other disciplines like that, because it's very much a social category that we use across different societies, and that clearly has a real effect on people's sociality, how we relate to one another. There sometimes even effects on how they reproduce, with whom they reproduce, and so on, right? So it is a scientifically valid concept, but when approached this way.
Yeah, I would say that we need a new way of doing science to approach it. The way
Okay.
science got set up means that this kind of the issue falls into the cracks. The issue of human organisms as social beings is very, very difficult to get across. And, there are whole swaths of the humanities who will talk about bodies, but they're not talking about actual bodies. It's a very abstract notion. The actual
Yeah.
body that can, manifest hunger and desire and pain and whatnot doesn't seem to enter into the discourse on bodies. And then you end up with the sciences who kind of ignore a lot of the messiness of society.
Yeah.
So a new kind of science needs to be developed to deal with that. And it's the type of thing where disciplines as they evolved in academia just aren't well suited to doing it.
Mhm. So, of course, when we earlier talked about the hereditarians, we mentioned things like intelligence, IQ, and we were focusing mostly, and that's also the reason for that is the fact that many times they also tend to focus on more psychological, behavioral traits than really more anatomical, physical traits. But when it comes to body form, what do we know about the main factors that play a role in its variation among human populations?
Not nearly as much as we think we did. So I think that if we're dealing with issues of what I'll call body form composition or body composition, things that go along with the rules that are supposed to match mammals to their environments based on how the prevailing temperature. So Bergman's law and Allen's law having to do with how sort of big and round you are, or how long your limbs are and things like that. Now in humans, you do see a bit of that. It's quite a bit of it is not attributable to natural selection. So it doesn't appear to be an adaptation. There is a sort of incidental correlation that arises from the way that human variation was set up in the last 50,000, 60,000, 100,000 years,
Yeah.
and latitude, so that you end up with a correlation. That correlation is highly diminished when you control for the fact that human groups are related to one another. Now, there are also some issues of how differences in nutrition and differences in consumption of different foodstuffs, or whether you tend to face food scarcity at different points in time in different environments. That affects growth in a number of different ways that can affect body form. So you see interesting secular changes as societies end up with more secure food supplies and different kinds of food oftentimes. So stature is a wonderful example of that. Over the past 100 years, many different societies have grown many centimeters in height as diets have changed, as you end up with waterborne diseases are taken out of the equation by sewer systems, things like that.
And
So,
actually, we saw the opposite when humans adopted agriculture, right? I mean, the height diminished for I mean, comparing to, for example, foragers, hunter-gatherers, the people who lived in societies initially that were based on agriculture, looking at their skeletons, their height was reduced.
yes, again, this is sort of beyond my expertise, and there are a whole batch of new
Yeah.
papers that deal with stature estimates using genome-wide association studies, to the extent that that will work to try to investigate that. So I don't know what the going opinion on that is, but certainly that's the type of thing that is entirely plausible that you could end up with in that. If you are a sedentary agriculturalist who lives in one area for a long time, and you're surrounded by quite a few animals and quite a few other humans, just the disease burden is going to be quite a bit higher. And for a lot of these diseases that we think about causing problems for children when they're young.
Yes. So I would like to ask you also, before we move on to the last topic of our conversation, we've been talking about different kinds of mechanisms that operate in the evolution of traits, complex traits, and so on. What about evo-devo approaches? I mean, what do we know about the role that developmental processes themselves might play in shaping evolution? And by the way, if they shape evolution, in what ways does that happen? Exactly.
So the ways in which developmental processes shape evolution has to do with the ways in which they allow variation to be presented in a population. So if you think about long bones, the bones of your arms and legs and that sort of thing, that grow in length because we have growth plates. And we know how growth plates work through developmental biology and a number of other disciplines. And there are only so many ways you can get a growth plate to speed up its growth or slow down its growth.
Yeah.
Those are limited. And those tend, at least in most mammals, to, say, be bilaterally symmetrical to one degree or another, and that type of thing. So if you, depending on which mutations you introduce into the population in which genes, you might end up with a situation where all of your limbs grow more quickly. You end up with longer limbs. But in one circumstance, you are dealing with how quickly cells replicate in the growth plate as opposed to how big they get or how rapidly they become hypertrophy, that is, swell in size, which are two of the phases that are involved in growing a growth plate. All right, so what does this do? Well, if things grow together, they can end up being correlated with one another and correlated genetically, like we were talking about earlier. So development can structure the ways in which organisms are prone to correlated responses to natural selection. So two characteristics might be highly correlated at one age and not so correlated at another age. So depending on where natural selection is manifest in the life cycle, you could end up with very independent evolution of the two characteristics or a very tightly connected evolution of the two characteristics. So evo-devo is very important for understanding how variation gets produced in a population. Now, there's in addition to sort of figuring out why things are correlated the way they are and how they'll respond to random genetic drift and natural selection, one of the things to think about is that the variation that you see in a population today is really not the variation that got the population there over the long term. All of that's been turned over by mutation and drift and selection and so on and so forth. Maybe there's been some gene flow or hybridization that sprinkles a little bit in there. It turns over and over and over again. And even though that happens pretty regularly, you end up with pretty much the same critter through time. And so what that means is that there's something robust about development in the evolutionary context that needs to be explained. And there are a couple of interesting biases because we typically only see organisms by the time that we know, say, a mammal is pregnant or an egg's been laid or so on and so forth. And there's a lot of mortality that happens before that. So lots and lots of conceptuses in humans just don't make it to the point where anyone knows someone's pregnant. So there's quite a lot of bias in terms of that. But still, even if you take that into consideration, where we're not seeing all the really horrible mistakes that development makes, there is something robust about it. And it's robust to not just environmental differences, it's also robust to genetic differences in some ways. And so the ways in which variation can be manifest is very important for understanding how longer term evolution is going to take place. So at what kind of variation do you need to get from point A to point B in a space of possible morphologies?
So getting then into the last topic of our conversation today, I would like to ask you about a very interesting Scientific American article from last year that you wrote with Kara Ocobock, who, by the way, I'm going to interview later this year as well. So, and the title is "To Understand Sex, We Need to Ask the Right Questions." And I know that this article actually on social media and elsewhere generated a lot of controversy. But before we get into that, what was the main argument you were making there? Because I guess that to avoid misconceptions here that probably lots of people have about it, what, in your own words, what was the argument here?
So to make sure that biology is more than stamp collecting, just a recitation of facts, we have to think about how we relate different things in the world together with theory. And this involves structuring questions. And in general, that's kind of how I go at things. I like to assume that, well, I don't know what this is. I'm going to research it. If I knew what it was, I wouldn't be doing research. I'd just be, showing off how much I know. And that's not my job. That's not my point. My point is to figure interesting things out. And that includes questioning things that people kind of take for granted. And so a lot of the discussions around sex seem to be blending together a whole bunch of different questions, a whole bunch of different goals, a whole bunch of different types of things that people want to explain. So the way that, I look at sex as someone who studies genetics of complex traits is in mammals, in terms of say, the number of sexes. Well, the question I'm asking is, how do these mice reproduce? How does recombination work? That's very important when we're dealing with the genetics of complex traits. How, and a number of very, very basic things. So for me, in that context, two sexes, male and female, probably works pretty well. And that's sort of where my expertise ends. I'm not much of a behavioral biologist. I don't do anything in the way of reproductive ecology and so on and so forth. Now, there might be other questions for which you might want to divide up sex in a couple of different ways. You may not want to divide up sex at all. Now, that's beyond my expertise as a scientist. Okay. So for me, two is fine. And for my purposes of my question, no problem. So one of the funny things is about the response was that people thought I was trashing the sex binary. And that's completely not the point that I was making. In fact, I rely on it to make a living, but in that context. And the article sprung out of a bunch of discussions that Dr. Ocobock and I had about how people are talking about the spectrum of sex, or many, many, many different categories. And the problem with looking at it in those ways is that, say, if you have a spectrum, and it's along one dimension, you still kind of have a binary. It's polar.
Right.
And is that doing what these people wanted to do in the end? So people who argue for that. And then if you have a bunch of different categories, well, you don't really have a spectrum. So ultimately, when it comes down to it, whether I think it's a binary, so I really don't have to worry about the mice that don't breed or don't make it, or mom gets hungry after giving birth and eats one of them. That happens. I don't need to concern myself with that in my research. But other people may have to. And there are quite a few different questions out there. There are quite a few different ways of going at it. And I'm inclined to see what happens. But I would like to see questions be at the front and center. And whether a binary works in a given situation really depends on what kinds of questions you're asking. Now, somebody might say, well, okay, there's a spectrum. You're really talking about gender when you should be talking about sex. Okay, I don't know, that's beyond my expertise as a scientist. Any number of other applications like that. And I think that there's a temptation for scientists to say that the science is established and therefore social policy ought to be a certain thing. And I don't think that that's what science is for. And this is the second argument in the article. As a citizen of a country, I ought to have a voice in political decision making. I'm certainly in favor of democracy, and I think everybody should have that opportunity. But there's a difference between my opinion as a citizen and my expertise as a scientist. And a lot of these decisions strike me as not being all that scientific. A lot of them have to do with the politics and the ethics and the morality of the situation, which is well beyond the purview of science. If we're talking about competition in sports, well, I mean, why do we structure the competition in the way that we do in the first place?
Right.
We think about fair competition where do our notions of fairness come from? Why are we, is there some other way that we might be able to do this that allows us to have fun in certain ways, or you get the competitive bug out, or whatever we might do, that are rather different, given the diversity of games that are out there and the way that they're played. It seems like there are quite a few options. So I think that without the questions, on one hand, and without a little bit of scientific humility and a recognition that there's a larger political process that needs to be respected and that's important, then it's very easy to get lost in a hashtag war and pick sides.
So about all of what you said there, I have 3 or 4 questions that I want to ask you before we go. So first of all, are there questions that would be left unanswered if we did not consider how sex might vary across species? I mean, that is, if we might not consider that perhaps in certain species or in certain contexts, it would be better for us to consider more than 2 sexes, less than 2 sexes, or any other variation of that.
Yeah, well, there are, if you're just interested in who has a big gamete and who has a small gamete, eggs and sperm or whatnot, you are missing out on just about the entire reproductive system. And the degree to which you can predict everything else about the organism based on the gametes, including how sex determination works, is kind of limited in many ways. And on top of that, there are many organisms where there are individuals who don't necessarily reproduce. So haplodiploid insects and that sort of thing, we typically talk about males and then queens and then workers or something like that, and they're usually described as sisters of the queen or something like that, but they're really haploid. Or you end up with a situation where no matter what you do, you have to do a lot of explaining to explain the particulars of the situation, and we can expect that in biology. What it comes down to when it comes to sex, it really matters, kind of which questions we're asking. So, our naked mole rats who help out their mother, the queen of the colony, who suppresses the reproduction of all the other females and so on and so forth. How do we want to talk about sex in that situation? I can see there being a lot of complications and a lot of interesting things to talk about, but I'd like to see it linked to a theory, linked to a question, as opposed to people just saying these are the facts. Because if science has a rough reputation with facts, they tend to turn on science pretty quickly. So, yeah.
And I was actually going to ask you, to what extent does the question, how many sexes are there, matter? Because I'm asking you that because many times we hear, and of course this is mostly politically motivated people, but we hear that if there isn't a set number of sexes, usually they are referring to 2 sexes, then it's basically anarchy scientifically and so on. But I mean, to what extent does answering that question really matter, or having a definite answer to that question?
Well, I'm not sure. A matter in what context, I guess, is what I'd ask. In the sort of narrow explaining the world science type of thing, or
yes, in that sense, yeah.
Well, So if you're say a demographer, or if you're breeding animals in an experimental context or something like that, maybe it doesn't matter all that much, and two will do. Okay. Let's say that you just are kind of interested in how many individuals there are to reproduce and that sort of thing. And all you need to know are sort of basic properties of fertility and mortality in a population to extrapolate what's going to happen over the next couple of generations. So that's great. That doesn't really deal with the properties of individual organisms all that much. If you're interested in individual organisms and you're interested in uh, sexuality, the expression of sex, then maybe you don't want to tether it to gametes per se. And we can certainly see this taking place in a number of different ways across the animal world. But I would say that whether clownfish change sex or whether there are different male morphs that are either defend a territory or sneak in on a territory or mimic a female or something like that, that matters very, very little for how we structure our society as humans. I really don't think that we ought to be looking to evolution and nature and all that sort of thing for moral guidance. We have to look to each other. In terms of scientific anarchy, yeah, that's a bit of an overstatement, in the sense that science is ideally a little bit anarchic, in that you're supposed to be able to ask questions, answer them to the best of your ability, and change your mind if things don't look, if your explanation doesn't look like it's working out terribly well. And ideally, that shouldn't be driven by appeals to authority or appeals to tradition and that sort of thing. Of course, they are, but a little bit of freewheeling thinking does not hurt science, and it's certainly not pseudoscience so long as you're asking questions that will allow you to say, "Whoop, I was totally wrong. I'm going to give up," or, "Well, I might be right about this, but it's a little bit over here. Doesn't seem to be working terribly well, and I need to readjust it." So that is that's the way that I'd put it. And again, I'm maybe a little bit vague here because this is outside of my realm of expertise as a scientist. For me, two's just fine for most of my work. I'm not going to dictate to other people what they ought to be doing, but I do expect them to come to me with a theory and questions, and not just tell me that these are facts and I need to shut up and go away.
And also, I mean, of course, if I'm saying something stupid here, please correct me. But also, when it comes to even definitions themselves, I mean, in this case, we're talking about sex and what would sex be or mean. But isn't it the case that people can still be doing very useful work and advancing science, even if we have evolved definitions, or sometimes even definitions themselves change as we uncover more about how things work, like, for example, definition of gene, the definition of species, and I guess that for sex it would be the same. And even, I mean, sometimes even without having any concrete definition at all, we can still progress science, right? At least that's how I look at the history of science when it comes to understanding what the gene is, what the species is, and I guess currently what the sex is. Right.
Yeah, I think that the definition of gene and the definition of species are great examples. The definition of gene seems to have wrapped back around to its original definition after it went through, it used to be this factor on a chromosome, and then, or they didn't really know about chromosomes then, or know how they were, well, anyway, and the Then it sort of became narrowly biochemical. Then people realized, this is not working. And then looks like all traits are complex, and it's kind of back to being a factor again, right? So there's a cycle there. And species is a really interesting one, and this is the one that Dr. Ocobock and I used in the article, in the sense that species concepts are useful in different situations. There isn't such a thing as a identifiable species. If you want to start a big fight amongst biologists, tell them to argue about species concepts. It's a disaster. It's just at each other's throats. It's crazy. But if you take the biological species concept, and the nice thing about that is that while it's not applicable to the vast majority of life, it does come with a set of questions saying, okay, identifying those individuals with whom you can mate and produce viable offspring, or offspring that aren't penalized by hybrid inviability or and anything like that. You might need to evolve a set of mechanisms that allow you to discriminate in one level or another. And so that comes packaged with a whole set of ideas, a whole set of conceptual tools and theory to structure your questions. And it may be that, well, these aren't biological species. They may be two species on either side of them, or two groups of organisms on either side of a mountain range. Well, they interbreed just fine, but they never actually interbreed, and they look really different. And that occasionally happens. And in that case, you've answered a set of questions and you've generated a number of other questions. Maybe you want to talk about this species in terms of lineages now. How did the actual pattern of mating, as opposed to the possible pattern of mating, take place? And then that comes with another set of questions associated with it.
Right.
And it's important to say that, just to throw up your hands and say that it's all very complex. There's so much stuff out there. We need to celebrate the complexity. Okay, but that's an aesthetic choice, or a rhetorical choice. It's not conducive to developing a theory that can structure questions.
So, since you mentioned earlier that in your case, for example, a sex binary tends to work quite well in the study of the evolution of complex traits, let me ask you just one question. And again, I'm trying to avoid the politics here. I don't want to get into that, but many times I hear on social media, podcasts, and elsewhere, people claiming, and I'm bringing this claim to the table because it's a scientific one, that the way you define sex is on the basis of a gamete size. But I mean, it might not be, or perhaps it's not reducible to just that. Right.
Yeah. And so again, this kind of gets to the question of how you relate gamete size to other things. If you're just looking at gamete size in isolation, congratulations, you've noticed that one gamete is of a different size than another.
Yeah.
This does not make you Einstein. What matters is the set of connections you can make to other things out there in the world. And a lot of times I don't really see that happening in a careful way. I think that a lot of talk of spectra is not doing the kind of work that a lot of people think it is on the other side. Certainly not all that compatible with categories, many different categories of sex. A lot of questions need to be clarified. And when those questions are clarified, when you clarify how you're interested in things relating to one another, then you can make progress. But if you're just counting, that's not a particularly interesting scientific exercise.
So let me ask you just one last question then. Of course, I've alluded to the fact that you got different kinds of reactions to this article on social media and elsewhere. I mean, looking at some of those reactions, what do you think are perhaps the things that people got wrong the most when it comes to interpreting what you were saying in your article? And what are
Mhm.
perhaps some of the most interesting reactions you got to it?
Yeah, uh, a pile of hate mail, that was for sure.
I guess we all get a little bit of that now and then.
Yeah, it's the really, really thick envelopes that you got to worry about. Uh, yeah, um, there's a tendency among the people who are in favor of a sex binary and only sex binary to claim that any sort of uh, questioning of that is a part of uh, a elaborate scheme to undermine Western civilization and you know kill everyone.
It's the woke mind virus, right?
The woke mind virus. And what's kind of interesting is that uh, as you probably can tell, I'm much more sympathetic to sex binary in a lot of
Hmm.
situations than perhaps a lot of other people would be.
Yeah.
And that's because I use it and I can show you how it works for those questions.
Hmm.
Um, I thought that I'd get a little bit of pushback for the part of the article where I do, where Ocobock and I do that, um, or do say that the binary might do in certain situations. Um, what I thought was interesting was the uh, part where we talk about how, as scientists, we have a role in society, uh, but that's secondary to our role as citizens, and that secondary role is an advisory one. I can have my opinions. I've got lots and lots and lots of opinions. I don't think that I am expert enough in everything in the world that I can offer an expert opinion about everything, and that I need to be careful about that. So, uh, didn't really get much response to that part of the article, and that silence was kind of interesting, saying that you know the science matters, but it's one of those things where it's in a constant state of negotiation. As you pointed out, we seem to make progress even though we regularly revise the most basic things that we think about, but or the way we think about very basic things.
Hmm.
And I thought that that would get a little bit more attention, and it would seem to be completely ignored. And uh, I'm not precisely sure why the statement about the binary being useful was completely ignored by every side there. So, but that's social media, and
Hmm.
that's more about laying claim to being on a team, and that sort of thing, as opposed to Twitter's not a very good place to figure things out in detailed argument. But yeah, and it was fun to write, and Dr. Ocobock and I disagree on a lot of things, and
Hmm.
um, we we agree on a number of things, and this was sort of a kind of a statement that we thought was a fair summary of both of our opinions on the matter and how they overlap, and pointed to a few places where in which they diverge. But um, then again, if you're inclined to write massive physical hate mail and send it to me at my work address, you're probably not doing a whole lot of deep reading and contemplation of it. But yeah, that's that's a hazard that that I'm aware of, and it's one
Mhm.
that I'm willing to take.
Right. So, apart from the article, which I'm of course leaving a link to in the description of
Hmm.
this interview, where can people find you and your work on the internet?
Um, I have a Google Scholar profile. Uh, I don't really have a professional website. Uh, and I do have a Twitter account that I'm reasonably active on, although most of my more scientific interactions take place on Blue Sky these days. But you can find me in both of those places.
Okay, great. So I'm leaving that all in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Roseman, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been really a pleasure to talk with you.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing more of your interviews. You're a real asset on the internet, so I appreciate it.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingboard, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.